Back in the 1950s, monster movies were everywhere, and probably one of the biggest names in that business was Godzilla. But as big as that titan of a monster happened to be, he didn't hold a candle to the original big bad name in the industry. None other than the eighth wonder of the world himself, King Kong. And after a very long break, the giant gorilla would be getting his third outing in what would also become Godzilla's third film, a movie that would fundamentally change the monster series forever. King Kong vs. Godzilla is a 1962 comedic monster film directed by Ishiro Honda, who returned after not coming back to do the second Godzilla movie. In the time since that first Godzilla movie had been released, Honda had made a lot of monster films for Toho, Mothra, Rodan, and Varan the Unbelievable, to name just a few. And now, he was returning to direct what would become the most successful Godzilla film ever made at the time, and what would eventually change the franchise away from its serious and nuclear metaphoric roots into a more bombastic versus series aimed at younger audiences. I've already gone into detail before in the past on how this movie got made, which details the unfortunate corporate sleaziness that led to the sad death of Willis O'Brien, so I'm not going to go over that again here, but needless to say, the third King Kong film was initially intended to be far different to how it turned out.
Willis O'Brien penned a story, and I think maybe even a draft script for King Kong versus Frankenstein. Now, he took that to RKO, and they introduced him to a producer. And that producer, without O'Brien's knowledge or consent, took that to what is classed in this particular book, A Century of Model Animation by Ray Harryhausen, took that to a Japanese film company. Now, I can only imagine who that Japanese film company is, because it doesn't actually state it in the book.
Toho, now owning the rights to make something with King Kong after buying that script, brought back Godzilla from his icy tomb that we last saw him in during the end of Godzilla Raids Again. And the rest is monster movie history, with Japan finding a new island, which was a place where natives worship a giant-sized Kong that is being forced to fight Godzilla in order to boost ratings for a company struggling to adapt to modern programming. King Kong vs. Godzilla, for those of you who haven't guessed it just yet, is very self-aware, and it's a movie that knows exactly what kind of wild antics it's getting into from the very first frame. The music, by the way, this time around happens to be some of the best in the series, in my opinion, and it's something that a lot of people have pointed out as being another iconic aspect of the film. Of course, I'm talking about the Japanese version, by the way, and not the American one, which for some reason wanted to play some stuff straight, and the jokes completely fly over your head, so you think the movie is actually like just bad instead of being cheesy on purpose, which is what it was actually trying to do. It's hard to explain, but the version that Japan wrote and released is much, much better. Now, contrary to what I've heard people say before in the past, I'm not someone who hates the majority of the Showa era of Godzilla films. It's a lie, Hulk Hogan! But I do recognize them for being significantly lesser quality than what came before with the 1954 original. In fact, here's a crazy concept for people to accept. You can like bad movies and still acknowledge them as being not that great, but hey, that may be something hard for me to get over into other people's heads in this current world climate. It's enough to get me to the boiling point! With that being said, you may also find it hard to believe that I actually think this is the second best Godzilla movie in that Showa continuity. And it's a movie that I think plays to the strengths of the genre that Toho had developed at the time, and even perfects a lot of wild ideas that didn't really get followed up on properly in other entries. King Kong vs. Godzilla is a comedy. It's not dark, it's not serious, and it's no longer as intense as it had been before in the past. But what it lacks in that department, it makes up for in absolutely insane monster movie fun. This is the kind of Godzilla film that would be immediately recognizable by people all over the world for decades to come, and there's a very good reason for that. You see, the way Japan actually calculates their box office is by ticket sales, and apparently King Kong vs. Godzilla cleaned up so good that they kept re-releasing it over the years, and it just became this gigantic hit almost instantaneously. It's been called the Godzilla movie with the most ticket sales to date, and did something around $11.2 million million during its first theatrical run. For comparison's sake, movies like Godzilla vs. Gigan, Megalon, and Mechagodzilla have sold 1.8 million, only 980,000, and then 1.33 million to date, with the final film in the Showa series, Terror of Mechagodzilla, only selling 970,000 tickets. So yeah, with a number like 11.2 million and eventually selling 12.5 million after re-releases. Keep in mind, guys, if these numbers could be a bit different, I'm American, we're using Wikipedia as a basis, but yeah, that is a noticeable margin or success over the other entries. Bottom line, look, King Kong vs. Godzilla, that was a huge movie, and it changed the franchise forever because of the success. From here on out going forward, Godzilla would become a much more bright and versus-oriented franchise that dropped much of the dark and mature subject matter in favor of the over-the-top and anthropomorphic style. Gone were the days of Godzilla being treated like a vicious animal, and at this point in time, we switch over to something of a human-like being that would start to act like a totally different monster than what we'd seen before. The best way I've ever heard anyone describe this was on a comment from my Godzilla Raids Again video, where somebody pointed out that this is our Jason doesn't get his mask and start doing standard Friday the 13th stuff until the third movie. And that's kind of a spot-on analogy for Godzilla. After Toho acquired the rights to a King Kong film, no matter how unfortunate and seedy as they may have been, the resulting product was notably less Godzilla and far more Kong. In fact, I'd go as far to say that this is less of a Godzilla movie than it is a Kong film, especially for the time in which it was released. And because of its success, it radically shifted the Godzilla series into being more like King Kong in later films. You see, at the time, everyone knew who King Kong was. People all over the world recognized Willis O'Brien's legendary monster film as the granddaddy of all adventure movies. Japan had thrown their hand in the ring of trying to make silly little imitations of Kong off of that giant reputation, but even then, when they made this movie, not everyone really knew who Godzilla was. Sure, we knew of the Raymond Burr movie, but remember, Godzilla 2 was released in America as Gigantus the Fire Monster, so even if you figured out that this was a movie reusing that Godzilla's design, it still didn't call itself Godzilla at all. In fact, for all intents and purposes, King Kong vs. Godzilla kinda was Godzilla 2 for a lot of people unaware of what was going on. But Toho ran with the idea of having Godzilla fight Kong, and in doing so, made what became one of the most recognizable monster movies that they ever released. Still, this radical change in direction did not sit right with many people. Ishiro Honda included, who, remember, he directed the 1954 original. He would even state, quote, "I don't think a monster should ever be a comical character. The public is more entertained when the great King Kong strikes fear into the hearts of the little characters." But Toho insisted on making the movie as funny as possible, in a similar way to how Son of Kong was deemed to be made funnier, because they knew they couldn't outdo the 1933 King Kong. To quote that movie's screenwriter Ruth Rose, she stated back in the day that if you can't make it bigger, make it funnier. I do find all of that kind of hilarious, though. A lot of the special effects crew didn't like this direction at all and couldn't believe some of the stuff that goes down in the movie. But remember, this is what made Godzilla the household name he is today, so to say it paid off is an understatement. Ishiro Honda has commented on the movie being a parody of Japanese television at the time, saying that people were making a big deal of ratings, but my own view of TV shows was that they didn't take the viewers seriously, that they took the audience for granted, so I decided to show that through my movie. The reason I showed the monster battle through the prism of a ratings war was to depict the reality of the times. Of course, this movie wouldn't exactly have everyone praising it when it came out, because, like I mentioned before, it kind of goes hand in hand with the death of Willis O'Brien, a monster movie icon, and how the handling of its inception went about destroying the hopes and dreams of someone who had done so much for the genre. Which is why Godzilla fans of Toho probably don't understand why people are so opposed to some of those sillier films. It's a point of view that's diametrically opposed to their film series that they love and the success it's gotten, so naturally you have opinions that will clash. Marion C. Cooper, who was a producer on King Kong from the 30s, even even stated that he was indignant that some Japanese company made a belittling thing of Kong by stooping so low to use a man in a gorilla suit, which he spoke out against in the early days of the first movie. He tried as hard as he could to file a lawsuit to stop Toho and claimed that he owned King Kong, but that never really materialized, and King Kong vs. Godzilla went on to carve a legacy of over-the-top silliness anyways. So you can see that at the time of its release, both the creators of King Kong and Godzilla were kind of opposed to what was going on here with this third movie. With Ishiro Honda commenting further on a movie like Godzilla Raids Again, which he did not direct, with a more positive reception that Godzilla 2 got in response to his original movie, noting that people called his film stupid to have high themes and ideas despite being a science fiction movie. His quote was, "That's why I think the first Godzilla was considered a weird movie. That's probably why they liked the second movie better." Still, with all of these changes came what would become the biggest Godzilla film ever at the time. All it took was a backstabbing movie deal, the dumbing down of iconic monsters, and the parody of the genre and television as a whole. Anyways, with all of what I've said, I will still say that King Kong vs. Godzilla is a funny movie, and I dare say it's the second best film in the Showa era. It knows what kind of movie it is, and in a similar way to what Jurassic World did by parodying the concept of movie sequels in a climate of non-stop corporate greed, it satirizes the concept while also being a breath of fresh air. No, it isn't as good as the 1954 original, and it's nowhere near King Kong's level, but I do think it to be fun in its own right. It's just a shame that it had to coincide with the death of Willis O'Brien and the radical reformatting of what it meant to be a Godzilla movie. If you're looking for something fun, nonsensical, and entertaining with a story about Kong being an underdog in the fight against Godzilla, a literal radioactive prehistoric beast that shoots atomic breath at a giant-sized monkey, well then you can do no better than the 1962 movie King Kong vs. Godzilla. A well-directed and massive hit with beautiful music that Ishiro Honda returned at the helm, and it's also Kong's third official outing that wasn't some unlicensed project like what we'd seen from Japan before in the past. But hey guys, those are all just my own thoughts on the subject matter. What do you think about King Kong vs. Godzilla? And what are your thoughts on how this movie changed the films that came after it? Personally, like I said, I prefer Godzilla to be a dark and serious metaphoric monster, but money talks, and this movie is what led the rest to follow suit. I don't really have a problem with people having different opinions. I think everybody should just kind of learn to love one another. So whatever your own thoughts and opinions on this film happen to be, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below.